We had just finished installing a 3.5-inch suspension lift on our Silverado when we proceeded to put it back to work and load it up with 20 bales of hay. Before installing that lift kit, we had loaded up this truck in the same way, and it sat about level with all that weight in the back. These pictures were taken while the truck was at stock height other than the leveling kit in the front end. I had bought the truck used, and judging by the condition of the bed when I bought it, I'm pretty sure it had been used to haul gravel and/or heavy equipment. Then I purchased it, and on several occasions did surpass the load rating. According to the sticker on the door, the gross vehicle weight rating is 7,000 pounds, and when we recently weighed the truck, it came in at 5,600 pounds with a full tank of gas and all of the accessories that are bolted to it. So even just adding in 2 occupants and a bit of luggage, that only leaves around 1,000 pounds to spare. Even with just 1 occupant, the 20 bales of hay is pushing up against that rating. My guess is that they weigh 55 pounds each. So 20 of them in the truck means 1,100 pounds. With the 3.5-inch suspension lift kit installed, the truck sits at about 40 inches in the front and 40 in the rear. Measuring the fender height in the same way, with the load in the bed, the truck sits at 40 inches in the front and around 39 in the back. With that load in the bed, it's actually sitting lower in the back than it does in the front. That difference in height might not sound like too much, but the truck was already sitting lower in the back than I had wanted it to before even loading it up. Ideally, with no load, I'd like the rear of the truck to be sitting an inch or 2 higher than the front. With just 1,100 pounds in the bed, which should still be below the weight rating of the truck, the leaf springs were already pretty much out of lift. The 2 top ones were entirely flattened out and totally in contact with the overload leaf. This isn't really dangerous, and it is the system working as it's intended to, but either the leaf springs are just clapped out and/or they were never particularly strong to begin with. In an attempt to help address this, we'll be installing slightly stiffer than stock leaf springs. I couldn't quite definitively figure out the rating for the leaf springs that are currently on the truck, but going by the thickness of the pack, which is 1 13/16 of an inch, they seem like they're the 1,750 pound springs. I didn't want to get replacements that were too heavy and end up dramatically affecting the ride quality, so I ended up getting a pair of these 1,900 pound rated springs for about $250 plus shipping. I went with this brand because, well, they were the only ones that I could find a pair of in stock. So we're finally to the point in the video where we know what we're installing, and let's get to it. Well, almost. While we're in that area, there is one other thing we'll be taking care of. Most of the leaf spring replacement instructions for this truck have you dropping the gas tank. That's because the left side front leaf spring eyelet bolt is kind of blocked in by it. I've heard of a few different workarounds, like cutting the bolt out to remove the leaf spring, but it didn't seem like it would be all that hard to remove the gas tank, and there was another reason that I wanted to do it as well. While poking around underneath the truck, something that had drawn my attention was the condition of the fuel tank sending unit. And that condition is that it's, well, rusty as all hell. It's a plastic gas tank, but the sending unit sure is regular old steel. And judging from the condition of it, I'm guessing road salt sure likes to sit up here on top of the tank and eat away at this sending unit. Since we have a good excuse to remove the gas tank while installing the leaf springs anyway, this seemed like as good a time as any to replace the sending unit too. Unfortunately, it seems like the only replacement sending units available are complete assemblies including the fuel pump and the electronics. I really only needed the top part that sits outside of the tank, but I couldn't find a way to buy it separately. After a fair bit of searching, I did get lucky and was able to find this Bosch complete unit for about $75 sold as an open box item. And now that we have the parts that we need, we can finally get to work. We'll start by carefully backing the truck up into the garage, making sure that both sides are accessible, especially the left side where the gas tank is located. Since this is a fuel injection system and there's a fair amount of pressure in the lines, so before we remove anything we should depressurize the system. One of the easier ways to do this is to pull the fuse for the fuel pump, which disables it, and then you can just run the engine, which will empty out the lines. In this case, we had to pull both the fuse and the relay before the pump stopped running. If all else fails, you can just unplug the fuel pump connector. Once we started it, the engine ran out of fuel pressure in just a few seconds. So the lines have been depressurized, and we had timed this job so that the fuel tank was already pretty much empty in the truck anyway. Let's roll underneath and start removing the tank. The first thing is to remove this plastic gas tank cover. This is secured to the driver's side frame rail with 3 bolts. Once those have been removed, we'll guide it past the parking brake cables and it'll fall right off. The other side of the cover is just hooked onto the gas tank, so there are no other fasteners to remove. With that out of the way, the next thing we're going to do is unhook everything going to the gas tank. On a lot of vehicles, it helps to lower the gas tank a bit so that you have better access to everything, but in this case there was actually a fair amount of room between the tank and the bed, so we were able to do it with it fully installed. There are 2 electrical connectors attached to the sending unit that we will disconnect. Then there are 6 hose connections for us to remove, including the one for the gas tank filler. We'll start by disconnecting the high pressure fuel outlet line. These plastic fuel line tools make it pretty easy to separate GM's quick disconnect fuel fittings. Well, they normally do. In this case, the rust was preventing it from inserting fully into the hose connector. But finally, we made it happen, and you can see a little bit of fuel start to trickle out. So the line is disconnected, but that's not really how it's supposed to happen. Instead of the fittings sliding off of the sending unit, they were rusted together and the line simply broke. Now we're going to have to get that stuck piece out of the fuel hose, but I guess we'll deal with that later. For now, we'll go ahead and disconnect the other hoses. And now that we know we don't need tools to disconnect these, it significantly speeds up the disassembly process. The small vent hose fitting snapped right off. On the other hand, the bigger evap fitting didn't want to come off at all. So we decided to just leave that attached to the gas tank and disconnect the hoses from the other end. And that's really all we can get to for the moment. Once we have lowered the tank a little bit, we can more easily remove the filler hose. Other than that, we've removed everything attached to the gas tank except the 2 steel straps holding it in. So once we support the bottom of the tank with a floor jack, we'll go ahead and start removing the straps. Just like the fuel tank cover, each of those is hooked in on one end and bolted on the other. So all we have to do is remove 2 bolts to drop the tank. Once the forward bolt has been removed, we can unhook the other end of the strap and remove it from the vehicle. Then we'll do the same for the other strap. Well, we would, except that rear bolt is spinning, and not in the loosening kind of way. The bolt passes through the strap, and then a U-nut, and you can actually see the other end sticking up through this part of the frame. Clearly something is wrong with the U-nut, as the bolt is just spinning and not loosening. You could tighten down the bolt, then loosen it up a little bit, and then it would just stop and spin. So it wasn't just simply stripped out. We tried pushing down on the bolts with a pry bar while loosening it, but it didn't help. I figured we'd just try loosening it and tightening it a few times, and eventually the combination of that and prying down against the bolt did let us loosen it. Hey! By the time we finally got the bolt out, it was so hot I couldn't hold on to it. The threads are totally missing from this part of the bolt. Some of that might be from trying to loosen it, but I think it started with rust. Either way, that damage explained why it just stopped loosening at a certain point. I think the bolt was what actually failed, and maybe it was my aggressive impact tightening that caused the U-nut to start to spin. Either way, it's a rusty mess, and I don't want to reinstall it and just have to trust that it'll work next time. Here's the intact front strap hardware compared with the damaged rear strap hardware. We'll have to find a way to replace the rear parts before we can reinstall the tank. But for now, at least we can unhook the rear strap and fully remove it. Then we'll lower the gas tank down a little bit with the jack so that we have better access to the last hose. I don't have any close-ups of the filler hose being disconnected, but it's just a worm gear hose clamp and simple to remove. Once that has been separated, we can finish lowering the tank. Since it's mostly empty and made of plastic, the tank really isn't very heavy. So once the jack is down as low as it'll go, we'll simply push the jack out of the way and lower the tank to the ground manually. Then luckily, the truck is just high enough off of the ground to slide the gas tank out from under its frame rails. It gave us a much longer and weirder fight than we were expecting, but at least we did manage to land this catch. Now that the tank is just sitting here on the ground, we have better access and we'll try to clean it up a little bit. And by that, I mean I had Rob use the tiny shop vac to vacuum up as much of the rust and dirt as possible. And with things looking a little bit better, it's time to try to disconnect that last evap hose. I couldn't seem to get any of the quick disconnects in there, although I'm pretty sure it was because the tabs were rusted to that line. We'll try to loosen it with some flathead screwdrivers, although it feels a bit like disarming a bomb and it really just wants to break off. Now that the tabs have been loosened up, we can actually slide one of the quick disconnect tools in there, and the hose should slide right off of the fitting to the fuel pump sending unit. But instead of doing that, it just broke like the other fittings and we'll have to tear it all the way off. Luckily, we have a new sending unit, so we don't have to worry about breaking this one. Unluckily though, I don't have any molded replacements for any of these hoses. And thus, we began the journey of removing those rusted off barb fittings from inside the hose connectors. We'll start off with the high pressure hose, since this one is the most important. We clamped the steel fitting into the vise and started to pick apart the rusted off barb. We started with screwdrivers and pliers, and then we stepped it up to a drill. The idea was to kind of deburr the busted up edge of the fittings so that we could install a tap. The thinking being that the sharp tap would be able to grab a hold of that piece of tubing and hopefully break it loose. Pretty quickly, the tap bit in and was able to do just that. So it was spinning, but it was still pretty stuck in there. Because of the size of the tap and the rust still in the fitting, I couldn't seem to get a fuel line tool in there. So we'll just do it the old-fashioned way and pull up on the tap while manipulating each of those spring tabs with the flathead screwdriver. It can be hard to see, but do be careful not to stand directly over it when pulling up really hard.
Oh, I got it! I smacked myself in the jaw, but I got it! Oh, God. Ow.
Kind of amazingly, before I touched any of it, this connection was still totally sealed. The O-ring that seals the hose fitting to the steel hardline is still intact, so after a thorough wipe down and spray out with carb cleaner, we will be able to reuse that hose. For this vent hose connector, we were able to just pop up the tab like you were supposed to do in the first place, and then use pliers to wrestle out the broken piece of line. The real challenge though was this guy. This 5/8 inch evap hose connector would not let go of that broken piece of hardline. We tried the same trick that worked earlier, drilling it out with a step drill and then using a pipe tap to grab onto it, but it just wouldn't budge. In fact, we were just cutting threads onto the inside of that fitting. The only tap I had that was close to the right size was this 1/4 inch pipe tap, which means it cuts tapered threads, and I'm not sure if that was the problem or if the fitting was just that dang stuck. Once that was threaded in there, I tried very hard to lift up on the tap, but it just wasn't happening. I spent another 10 minutes trying to separate the two, and I just couldn't do it. With some more time, effort, and very careful drilling, I suppose you could probably drill out most of the steel and then just peel the remainder out of there. I kind of started to do that, but it ended up being too difficult to hold the plastic connector still while cutting into it. So I ended up just giving up on it. I don't like to be defeated by rust, but sometimes that's just how things go. Instead of using the fancy molded hose, we'll just use a standard 5/8 inch rubber hose when we reinstall the tank. So that's part of the equation done, but we still need to remove the old sender from the gas tank. And unsurprisingly, the lock ring was quite rusted in place. We'll go around in circles, hammering it loose with a mallet and screwdriver just a little bit at a time. This is also making a mess and breaking loose even more of that rust, so we'll have to keep cleaning it up. Once we finally do get the tank open, we want to keep as much of this rust out of there as possible. We'll hammer on it a little bit more, and at this point the lock ring was just starting to move. We'll repeat the process and do a little more vacuuming, hammering, vacuuming, hammering, vacuuming, and we're finally ready to finish separating the lock ring from the sending unit. Once we, pry it out of there. We'll lift that up and away, do one more round of vacuuming, and finally the sending unit is free. This one uses springs to space out the lower fuel pump assembly, so it pretty much just pops itself right out of there. And after a little bit of finagling, we have the whole thing separated from the tank. The good news is that the inside of the tank and the sealed off part of the sending unit looks quite good. Just for the sake of it, we'll use an electric external fuel pump to get the rest of the gas out of the tank. This will make it easier to reinstall and see if there's any sediment that we'll need to clean out before reinstalling it. Luckily, the inside of the tank appeared totally clean, so we didn't bother washing it out. Now we're ready to install the new sending unit, so we'll make sure it matches up to the old one. Other than the kind of hilarious amount of rust, they do appear to be identical. After thoroughly checking them over, we'll install the new O-ring included with the sending unit, and drop the Bosch part right into the tank. Just like the other part, this one is spring-loaded, so we'll have to hold it down as we install the lock ring. Unfortunately, I didn't have a replacement ring, so we'll have to reinstall the crusty old one. That's an oversight on my part, and I really wish I had replaced it. Or at least slathered this one in anti-seize or something. I really don't know what I was thinking. I must not have been myself that day. But a locking ring is better than no locking rings, so we'll get it installed. Just like removing it, this involves going around in circles with the hammer until each of the lock ring tabs is fully in its groove. After 3 more minutes of hammering, there we go. The new sending unit is fully installed. So I think that'll about do it. We can reinstall this and then we're done. Oh yeah, the leaf springs. Half of the excuse for removing the gas tank was to make it easier to change out the leaf springs. I'm very glad we took the opportunity and had a new sending unit to install before we ended up with a highly flammable sprinkler coming out from that sending unit underneath the truck. But with that taken care of, it's time to get to work on the leaf springs. We'll jack up the rear of the truck, put the frame on jack stands, and lower the axle so that the tires aren't touching the ground. We'll leave the jack under the axle to hold it up while we start removing some of the things we installed in the last episode. First up, we'll remove the lower bolt for each of the shock absorbers. This is as easy as holding the nut on one side and spinning the bolt out with the impact gun on the other. We'll carefully spin the bolt all the way out and release the pressure that's on the shock. Then we'll repeat the same process for the passenger side shock absorber. And once both of those bolts have been fully removed, we tried to get to the leaf spring shackle bolts, but realized that our big aftermarket trailer hitch was in the way. We were able to loosen and remove the nut holding the shackle to the frame, but there wasn't enough room to slide out the bolt. And once it appeared that there wouldn't be an easy way around it, we went ahead and started removing the hitch receiver. The front 4 are carriage bolts with square inserts that lock against the frame so that you don't have to hold the top with a wrench. For those, we can just spin loose the nuts with the impact gun. The rear 2 fasteners are bolts that thread up into the frame. We'll leave it hanging on the center fastener on each side until Sean is in place and ready to bench press the receiver. Then we'll finish removing those and the hitch drops free. And with that out of the way, we finally have access to all of the leaf spring fasteners. The front eyelet is held to the frame with a bolt and a nut. The nut is on the outside and we'll hold that in place while we put an impact gun on the bolt and spin it loose. The bolt is on the inside of the frame, facing right where the gas tank would be, which is why the tank should be removed. Once that's loose, we'll loosen up the 4 leaf spring U-bolt nuts in a crisscross pattern. We just installed these in the last video, but yeah, we do have to take them off to change out the springs. With the 4 nuts removed, the U-bolt plate can be removed and the bolts can be slid off of the leaf spring. Then we can lower the axle and remove the lift block, really just so that we have a little bit more room to wiggle the leaf spring pack out of there. And that's exactly what we'll have to do. First, we need to remove the bolts from the front and the rear of the leaf spring. We were able to pry out the front bolt, but the rear one needed some persuasion with the hammer. And once the shackle bolt was out of the way, the whole leaf spring drops down and sits on the axle. Then we'll lower the axle back onto the ground and slide the leaf spring pack off of it. This is a little easier said than done since these springs are pretty heavy and awkward. Having a friend help makes it much easier. Now that the leaf spring is separated from the vehicle, we can actually remove this bolt which holds the shackle to the rear eyelet. With the leaf spring mounted in the vehicle, there wasn't enough room to remove this bolt, which is why we had to remove the shackle with it. But now that it has been removed, it's easy to hold the bolt in place and spin loose the nut. Then with some tapping and a bit of spinning, we can get the bolt out. And to make sure we install this the right way around, we'll put the new leaf spring on the ground next to it. Here's the new leaf spring compared to the old one. The new leaves are just a tiny bit thicker than the old ones, and the whole pack has a bit more arch to it. To get it ready to install, we'll finish removing the shackle from the old leaf spring and slide it into place on the new spring. Then we can install that bolt and get it snugged down. We'll only fully tighten this once the springs are back on the truck and it's sitting on the ground. With that together, we'll wrestle the leaf spring back on top of the axle and slide it back through the shackle bolt. Then we need to get the front eyelet bolt through. A 4x4 on the floor jack helped hold the front eyelet in place. Then we'll use a dead blow mallet to fully push it into the frame and get the bolt through. We'll get both of those fasteners finger tight, reinstall the lift blocks, U-bolts, and U-bolt plate, and for now, just snug those down. And with that, we're pretty much done with the driver's side. We'll come back to reattach the shock and tighten all the fasteners down once we do the passenger side. The process over there is very much a repeat. We'll break loose the shackle bolt in the rear, and the eyelet bolt in the front. Then off come the U-bolts. We'll fully remove the front and rear leaf spring bolts, and slide the old leaf spring pack off of the truck. We'll switch the shackle onto the new spring pack and then get it on top of the axle. We'll line up and reinstall the shackle bolt at the rear, tap the front eyelet up into the frame, and install its bolt. Though for whatever reason, this one really didn't want to line up and took a lot of persuading. But eventually we got it back in place. Then the U-bolts get reinstalled and snugged back down. I think we'll be okay to reuse these U-bolts and their hardware. Once those are back in place, we'll roll the jack back under the axle, lift it up, and reinstall the lower side of the shock absorber. We'll get the bolt and nut finger tight, then do the same thing for the driver's side shock. We do still need to tighten everything down, but there will be enough room to do that with the hitch installed, so we decided to go ahead and reinstall the receiver. Once again, we'll have Sean bench press that, and hold it in place until the fasteners are on finger tight. Then we'll snug them all down, and tighten the 4 carriage bolts to 110 foot-pounds, then the 2 rear bolts to 103 foot-pounds, and that's the hitch reinstalled. Now we'll finally lower the truck all the way back onto the ground. We'll also bounce it up and down a bit to help the suspension settle. Now we have to roll back underneath and torque down all of the fasteners we've messed with. First, the lower shock bolts get tightened to 85 foot-pounds. Then we'll torque the upper and lower shackle bolts on both sides to 70 foot-pounds. And the front leaf spring eyelet bolts get tightened to 148 foot-pounds. And we'll go around in a crisscross pattern and torque all 8 of the U-bolt nuts to 74 foot-pounds. With that done, we're finally done with the leaf spring installation. But of course, we still have to get the gas tank back in. And that U-nut that would hold in the rear strap is still busted. I didn't have a new one of those, but I did have a bunch of these 3/8 inch U-nuts sitting around. But we didn't want to use the 3/8 inch bolt to hold in the gas tank, so we decided to cut off the threaded portion, sand the surface flat, and we went ahead and welded a 7/16 inch nut to that spring clip base. We took it slow so as not to overheat either of the parts, and of course we don't want to breathe in any of the coatings that we're burning off. The question you might be asking is, why do all that and not just use a 3/8 inch bolt? The answer should be pretty obvious. Of course it's... actually, honestly, I don't really remember. The only reason I can think of that we would have done all that is that I didn't have a grade 8 3/8 inch fastener that was threaded all the way up to the bolt head. These bolts have to be used to pull the gas tank up to the frame, so it really helps to have these be longer and fully threaded. That's my best guess as to why we went through all that effort. Really, a 3/8 inch bolt I think would have been just fine too. We'll give our welded together U-nut a coat of paint and everything a thorough slathering of anti-seize before we reinstall the hardware. Back on the fuel tank, we can start to reinstall the hoses to the sending unit. We'll be reinstalling each of these hoses with just a little bit of oil on the O-rings to help them slide into place. First up is the cleaned up high pressure fuel outlet hose. We'll make sure it's fully seated at the sender and click it into the little clips at the top of the tank. Then we'll do the same thing to reinstall this vent hose. This 3-part hose connects to this separate fitting at the rear of the tank, the side outlet on our fuel sending unit, And the third connector will go up to the fuel filler once it's back in the truck. Since I gave up on trying to salvage this evap hose, we'll just slide a piece of 5/8 inch rubber hose over the fitting and use a worm gear clamp to seal it. That's all the prep work done, so the tank is ready to be reinstalled. With the J-nuts back into place on the frame, we'll lift the empty gas tank back into place and once again support it with a jack. Once it's sitting where it needs to be, we can hook on the first of the two straps. We'll start with the front strap, and once the heavily anti-seized bolt is lined up, we'll spin it into place. Until we get both of the straps installed, we're just looking to snug this down. Now that it's partially held up, we can lower the floor jack and install the rear strap. Luckily, the bolt finds its home right away and tightens down without issue. I couldn't find a torque spec for these, and I'm not entirely sure I would want to use it anyway, so we'll just use a small 3/8 inch ratchet and get them nice and tight. Then we have to go around and make sure all of the other hoses are hooked back up. Since we kind of forgot to do it before tightening the straps down, the filler neck hose is a little bit more fiddly to install, but we did manage to get the hose installed and its clamp tightened down. We'll also tighten down the other end of that 5/8 inch hose to the evap canister with another worm gear hose clamp. Then, once everything has been confidently reattached, we'll reinstall the last part. We'll get the plastic gas tank cover hooked in on the passenger side, thread in and snug down the 3 hold-down bolts, then finish tightening them with a ratchet. And we're done, ready to start her up. Well, we do have to put some gas back in the tank since we totally emptied it out. Some of this is the gas that came out, and it's been filtered before putting it back in. Of course, we have to reinstall the fuel pump relay and the fuel pump fuse, then we can prime the fuel system and start the engine up. The fuel pressure climbs up quickly, just as it should, and then starts to settle back down. It's looking and sounding like everything is working properly. There isn't even anything spraying out onto the floor. It's kind of amazing, really. Now that everything's back together, we went ahead and measured the ride height. It hasn't really been allowed to settle yet, but the rear is now sitting at 42 inches, with no load that is 2 inches higher than the old pair of leaf springs. So the ride height is looking perfect, but there's one thing I don't really care for on these cheaper new leaf springs. And that's that the overload springs don't have any pads on them. These are the pads that are found on the stock leaf springs. These will help keep the leaves from smacking into each other if there's a heavy load in the bed when rolling down the road. But the new springs don't have any. In fact, they don't even have the provisions to mount any. I do want something on there though, so we'll just keep this simple and use one of my go-tos. We'll just take an 1/8 inch thick strip of rubber and tape it on. There, good as new, practically factory. That tape is still on there doing just fine over a year later, so I'm pretty happy with that solution. I will say that these aftermarket leaf springs do sometimes have a little bit of a creak to them. The factory leaf springs, for all their sagginess, did not make any noise at all. But I guess that's what I get for buying the cheapest ones I could find, and if that's the worst thing I can say about them, I'm still very happy with the purchase. The truck now sits like I always wanted it to. It's got a good ride height and the back is a bit taller than the front. At the same time, it's not too tall and the bed is still easy to load and climb up into. Of course, it would be silly to end this video without taking a look at how the leaf springs do with the load on them, so here it is after that install with 20 more bales of hay. The front of the truck is now sitting at 40.5 inches, and the rear right around 40. It does have new tires in this picture, and we'll cover that in the next episode, but they are the same size as the tires that came off of it, so it shouldn't have affected the measurements too much. With the same load in the bed as before, the leaves actually are getting fairly close to touching the overload, but at least on flat ground not moving, they're not quite there. This time, the leaves still have a good arch to them, there's no flattening out, and the bed is an inch higher. But the ride quality is still fine. I would say there's very little of a noticeable difference. But when the truck is loaded up with a lot of weight, it definitely handles it better than before. Oh, and the fuel sending unit has been doing just fine too. I haven't had any issues with the Bosch fuel pump or any of the lines or hoses down there since reinstalling it all. On the surface, it may not seem like we did anything huge in this video, But a lot of the time, that's just how cars are. You have to whittle away and do a little thing here and a little thing there to make them into what you want them to be. And of course, I'm always thankful for the friends that help me get it there.